And had I not gotten into that species hunting and understanding what the fish are feeding on and thrown that 6-inch, blue chub mimicking swim bait, I never would have caught that fish of a lifetime.
Hey everyone, John here from the Cast and Spear podcast, and we have back on the show Luke Ofgard from caughtoffguard.com, and he's going to share with you his 1 in 4 million chance fish that he caught, and it is a stunner. I've looked at the pictures online, and it is such a random fish. I'm not even going to spoil it. I'm going to have you listen to the end to hear what this fish was that he caught. But before we do that, if you haven't had a chance already to subscribe to the podcast, please do. All right, I know you're getting excited. Let's jump in. Please welcome back Luke Ofgard. Said you've caught over 10,000 fish already, so
yeah,
maybe you can elaborate on what is species fishing, how you got into it, how you kind of done all this stuff.
Definitely. So species fishing is something that's relatively new in the world of fishing. I would say it wasn't even a mainstream thing until about 10 or 12 years ago. There was this guy named Steve Wozniak, who's not the same Steve Wozniak that founded Apple.
I just interviewed him the other day.
Yeah, you did. That's awesome. Okay. Well, so your listeners are probably familiar with species hunting to some degree then. Well, in 2010, it was actually July of 2010, I was still in college at that point. I was getting closer to graduation. And I read this article in Field and Stream magazine about this guy, Steve, who just caught his 1,000th species. And I was like, man, this guy's awesome. Like, that's super cool. At the time, I really liked to fish. I didn't devote, as much time to trout fishing as I did everything else, but I still love to fish. So I'd fish for anything and everything that swims, basically. But it really took me a few years before I realized, I'm actually a species fisherman. In fact, it wasn't until probably 2016 or 17 that I thought, I'm actually going to go out of my way to try and catch new fish that aren't glamorous, not like driving across the state for a sturgeon, which is going to be huge and is going to fight hard, but I might drive a couple hours to go catch a tiny little species of chub that I've never caught before. And that sounds crazy to people, but I don't know. There's just this weird thing that's difficult to describe. And I was a kid who grew up playing the Pokemon games. And so I've actually equated species hunting to, Pokemon, but for adults. It's that thrill of being able to go out and, notch off a new species, much in the same way that birders do. They have their life list, and a lot of species fishermen actually call it lifeless fishing. But anyway, fast forward to 2017, about a year ago, that's when I first counted how many fish species I'd caught. I've kept detailed records, dating back to when I was a kid, and that's how I'm able to know how many fish I've caught, dating back to 2004, so when I was 14. Your readers can do the math for that one. But last year I counted, and I was at 105 in the fall of 2017, I believe. And in the time since, I've added more than 100 species. This year just has been phenomenal. I had a chance to travel all over. I got to fish in Canada this year, spent a lot of time in Florida. I had work in Texas, and I drove down, so I got to fish all over the Southwest and the South on my way there. And it really opened my eyes to not only how much is out there, but how beautiful, like, the world and all the species within it are. So there's these little tiny minnows that someone might not even think twice about, but that's what the trout and the bass are feeding on. And if you learn to chase these little things that people take for granted, and what the local fish are feeding on, it's going to make it much more likely for you to understand what you should throw at any given point. And not every river fishes the same, not even within our basin here. And so that's why species hunting really helped me out, because there was this fish that had existed right under my nose in the Klamath Basin, but I didn't even realize I'd been catching it until last year, or actually about 2 years ago. And that's the blue chub. Everybody's heard of this fish called the twee chub. It's invasive in a lot of places, but it's actually native here. And so growing up, I called twee chubs large-scale twee chubs, and this other fish, blue chubs, the small-scale blue chub. I could tell the difference between them, but I thought it was the same species. You never heard about this blue chub fish, and they do look different. One has larger scales than the other. The blue chub typically does have a little bit of a bluish-green tint on its back. And I tell you all this because once I realized that these blue chubs were different than the twee chubs, it influenced the lures that I started to buy depending on where I was fishing. And there's this place called Link River. It's the shortest river, well, one of the shortest rivers in Oregon. Actually, the D River up on the coast is shorter. It's like 200 yards. But Link River is just over a mile long, and it connects Upper Klamath Lake to Lake Ewanna. It is right where the initial town of Klamath Falls, which used to be called Linkville, was developed, and that's how Linkville got its name. And nobody really thinks of it as a good fishing destination. But for a couple months every year, it really can be. So the blue chubs are out in force, just feeding like crazy, and everybody's throwing primarily spoons and lures that mimic twee chubs, fish that we have that are much more common in other parts of the basin. But once I found out that, hey, these are blue chubs here, I changed the game a little bit and I started fishing swim baits, something that I'd done before, but I used a different swim bait. I used this swim bait called a Savage Gear 3D Reel Trout. And I used it in the color pattern, which is actually designed for Clear Lake, called a hitch, because it has the same look and color scheme as a blue trout, or excuse me, a blue chub. And it has that green-blue back, it's silvery sides, the profile is perfect, it's about the size of a full-grown blue chub, about 5.5 inches long. And it's huge for a trout lure. Most people think I'm not going to throw a 6-inch swim bait for a trout. Mm-hmm. Well, I saw that they were feeding on these, and so I was like, yeah, I'm going to throw this. So I did, and I take it out to Link River and had a really good day, hooked 5 fish. All these fish, they're big in there, so they're all between 23 and 28 inches long. And I had this day where I hooked 5 fish that size, and I lost every single one. And I was not happy. I was really frustrated. It's something you do after work in the spring. It's nice weather, but you only have a few hours. And I'm thinking, man, this is really frustrating because I could have had a phenomenal day, and I blew it. I lost all these fish. Mm-hmm. And the last fish I lost this day was indescribably beautiful. Like you see a fish in the water and you're like, oh, I have another fish. Well, this one was like silver white in the water, almost iridescent, and it was sort of cloudy out, but I could tell like it didn't look like the other fish. In fact, I thought it was a coho salmon, just like a chrome bright coho, but we're in a landlocked system. And so I'm thinking, I wonder if ODFW is just trying to, that's our Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, is just trying to screw with people. Maybe they had some leftover coho smolts, threw them in the basin, and they survived. But I didn't really know what to think about it. Well, the next day I come back and I'm throwing that same 6-inch swim bait and thinking, again, I'm probably going to have some fish bite the tail, trout bite from behind as opposed to bass, which are going to hit a swim bait in the head. So you need a hook that really sits farther back for an effective trout swim bait. And these swim baits are designed for bass. And so I'm thinking, that's probably why I lost some of those fish. They're striking short. So I go back the very next day to the same exact spot. And that day I caught 5 fish, all, again, in that 23 to 28, actually 27 inch range that day, all very good fish. And then I go to that spot, and at that point I had 4 fish landed, and I'm thinking, man, I wonder if that thing's still there. So I cast the same lure to the same spot half a dozen times, no takes. And I'm thinking, man, okay, well, I missed my shot at this weird freak coho salmon in the Link River. And then I'm like, you know what, I'm going to try something different. So I took a slightly different angle, and instead of working the swim bait downstream like I usually do or across stream, I just let it sit in the current. And I let it sit in the current a good 2 minutes without really even moving it, just sort of swaying it, an inch or two side to side, the same little current seam where I got the bite that first day. And after it's sitting there over a minute, I get a hit, and I'm like, oh man, this is it. So the same fish comes up, smacks it. I can see it's that like white color in the water, and I'm freaking out. I'm excited. Some guy who was on the other side of the river, there's a walking trail. He comes down, he sees I'm fighting a good fish, but he's still across the river. And at this point, I'm like freaking out, really excited, thinking, man, I really hope I don't mess this up. But this time the fish like hardly fought at all. And it came really easily. It sort of swam into the net. Once it saw the net, it was crazy, but I was able to land it. And I get this thing up close, and I kid you not, it was blue. And I'm like, this is really weird. And it wasn't a coho. I could tell it wasn't a coho, but it didn't look like the trout we normally have. And this thing was like blue white. Its eyes were yellow. Its eyes were yellow like a trout normally would be, but everything else, it didn't have any pigment on its skin except for blue. There was no pink, there was no red, no green, no black spots. And I'm thinking, man, this is super weird. So I took a couple really good pictures. And this was a nice fish. This is still one of the better fish I've ever caught out of the Link River. It's 28 inches long, right on the dot, weighed just over 8 pounds, which was a really, really good fish. It's the size of a steelhead. And I got all my pictures, and then I let it go because I was like, man, this fish is too cool. I can't kill it. If I want to get a replica, I got enough good pictures, I'll do that. So I let the thing go. And then I get home, and I started doing some research. And it took me about a week and a few emails, reading online. But ultimately, I found out that this fish was what they call a blue phase fish, much like an albino, which doesn't have any pigment. Blue phase trout have only blue pigment in their skin. And they're significantly rarer than albino fish, believe it or not. And I didn't know this until I started digging. But the only pigment they have in their skin is blue. And in the wild, they basically don't exist because typically when fish have this condition, they are less likely to reach sexual maturity because they don't have the same hormone load as a standard fish. They typically aren't as aggressive. They stand out in the water like a sore thumb, so they're usually subject to predation. And basically, like when you crunch the numbers, it's roughly a 1 in 4 million chance of catching these fish. So of those that survive, the chances that you have, basically 1 out of 4 million fish that survives to adulthood is going to be one of these blue color phase trout. And since they typically can't reproduce, it gets rarer over time because they can't really pass on that recessive trait. So without a doubt, like that is the coolest fish I've ever caught. I mean, I've caught bigger fish, I've caught fish that, can kill you, that have all sorts of crazy history behind them. But that fish was the one that I still think about every single time I go out fishing. And it's like, man, I'm never gonna beat that. I'm never gonna catch not only a 1 in 4 million fish, but one that's huge. One that's one of my top 25 largest trout ever. And by far, that's what stands out most in my mind. And had I not gotten into that species hunting and understanding what the fish are feeding on and thrown that 6-inch, blue chub mimicking swim bait, I never would have caught that fish of a lifetime.
Well, that does it for this episode of the podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. Luke killed it as always. And if you have your podcast app open, do me a huge favor. Just screenshot it real quickly and text it to a couple of your friends. Let them know about the podcast so we can help grow this thing to be the best fishing podcast on the net. Better yet, if you share it on any of your socials like Instagram, definitely tag me. It's @castandspear so that I can, follow along and give you a little thumbs up. Huge thank you. Much appreciated. All right. Until next time, everyone, keep those lines tight. See ya.